Okay, y'all, I think we'll go ahead and get started. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our second lecturer of the season tonight. Paulette Singley is a professor at Woodbury University in Los Angeles and a visiting professor here this year at AUS. I've been afraid of Paulette for going on 20-some years now, mostly because I didn't know her. I knew of her when we were both students at Princeton. She was in the PhD program, and I was in the graduate program, Master of Architecture degree program. And at Princeton at the time, the PhD students were the stars, intellectually superior to all others. And on occasion, I had heard Paulette in sort of informal conversation with her colleagues, and thus my fear. Fear mostly of really a question of awe. Her and her colleagues in that program seemed to have absorbed all knowledge and could disperse that knowledge on a whim in casual conversation. Last year I was sort of shocked to finally meet her in person when she came to campus and talk to us like regular people. Talk to me like a regular person, and most surprised that she's like nice, but the awe is still there. And a couple weeks ago, she gave a lecture in 201 to the students and those of us teaching in that class. And again, I was sort of struck by that wealth of knowledge and bringing information about a subject I sort of thought I knew something about, and sort of exposing me to the depth of my own ignorance, which is really quite pleasant. So please help me welcome Paulette, and hopefully we'll all enjoy our own ignorance tonight.
Thank you so much for that, Michael. How do I get the stage lights down? Do you know how to do that? Great.
Good.
That's perfect, I think. I'm going to do one thing here. Okay. So yes, thank you, Michael. I think we were all afraid of each other, in fact, at that time period, and mostly afraid of our professors, which is as it should be. I also wanted to thank, in general, the American University of Sharjah, Dean Varkey and Head of Department George, and former Head of Department Michael for giving me the opportunity to be here and take part in this amazing school that you have. It's already been a life-transforming experience to meet all of you and to work with you, and also the new colleagues that have come in with my cohort who are really amazing people. I've been thinking a lot about how incredibly fortunate I am and all of us are to be here. And it's not lost upon me that your ability to be bilingual is allowing me to come here and speak and teach in English. And there's just something really incredible about that. And who knows, maybe someday I'll be able to learn a little bit more Arabic, but I'm told it's, the most difficult language in the world to learn or something like that. But I'm really grateful for all of the mix of languages and people from all different parts of the world that have made this such a rich and amazing school to be in. It's an inspiring place. Wherever I look in the corridors, I see art and creative activities of some kind or another happening. Okay, I'll start. In his 1942 essay, The Analytical Language of John Wilkins, Jorge Luis Borges invented the celestial emporium of benevolent knowledge, where animals are divided into the following categories: those that belong to the emperor, embalmed ones; those that are trained, suckling pigs, mermaids, fabulous ones, stray dogs, those included in the present classification, those that tremble as if they were mad, innumerable ones, those drawn with a very fine camel hair brush, others, those that have just broken a flower vase, and those that from a long way off look like flies. As a graduate student in what Professor Michael was talking about, the fear and awe factor of being a graduate student, is about the time I started to collect words. And Borges' writing demonstrates the power of a taxonomical collection. That is, of a grouping of thematically shared subjects to establish meaning, or in his instance, non-meaning, absurdity. Collectors are the opposite of curators. They accrue information and artifacts rather than edit them down. Their job is to obtain more, or all, belonging to a certain area of inquiry. Some even collect collections. The curator sifts through the collection to decide what remains, what goes on display. The curator and the collector rely upon each other for survival. During graduate school, I think the reason that I started to collect words was mostly that I didn't know them, and I was afraid to raise my hand in class and ask, could you please say what that word means? So what I would do is I would write them down in this little book that I have here, I still have, and then I would stalk various colleagues in the corridors after class with my book, begging them to explain to me what the words meant. Now, you might think that one could just go to a dictionary and look the words up, but at this particular moment in time, there was the kind of headiness of architectural theory, and there were words like ontoteleological or phallogocentric. They weren't in the dictionary. It was simply impossible to look them up. So I would stalk people in the corridors and back alleys with my little book, and I would ask them to explain to me the word, much like the old joke goes, say, brother, can you pair a dime? This list of words kept expanding, and I would add notes, and I would sometimes have definitions, and sometimes I wouldn't. So we'd have things like homeostatic, or transcription, or aleatory, or anodyne, or the construction of subjectivity. Eventually, my collection of words started to focus on the gap between words and the objects they describe, or even between one word and another word, with an understanding that a gap is an inherently spatial and therefore architectural tool. Calligrams, that's a poem written in the shape of what it's talking about, in this case the Eiffel Tower, and Arabic calligraphy begin to fill this gap, spatializing letters into things. The calligram, to quote Manfredo Tafori, is apparently intended to delete the oppositions of our alphabetical tradition. It shows and it names, depicts and says, imitates and signifies, entices one's eyes and invites them to read. Among some of the words that I would look at in my collection, so I'm the collector, not the curator, is hoarding and constantly assuming and gathering information, useful or not useful, are words that would have specific kind of architectural implications to them. Sort of a kind of dead tech or steampunk aesthetic of mechanical instruments that would balance what I couldn't see going on in the digital environment. Things like an orrery or an escritoire, a very complicated desk for writing, or a clepsydra. In this case, perhaps not a proper clepsydra or water clock. This is the Jayran water clock, a water clock built by the Arab engineer Muhammad al-Sa'ati, and it was positioned at the gate of Damascus in Syria at the exit of the Umayyad Mosque in the 12th century during the reign of Nur ad-Din Zangi. I probably murdered some words in there. The catropic scintilla. This is an optical device with mirrors that reflect on either sides of the open doors little scenographic worlds that you can build inside of them. The canopic chest. This one is for King Tutankhamun. It would have contained his stomach, intestines, lungs, and liver. Through this process of exploring how words and space can come together, how words and architecture can start to inform each other, I started to look at homophones, not homonyms and not synonyms, but homophones. These are words that are spelled exactly the same but mean different things. And it's not a complete collection, but there's some examples. So rent, you can rent a car, but you can rent a piece of paper by ripping it. A rent is to rip. Or tear can drip down your face as a tear. Or again, you can tear your stocking. So does the tear tear? And when does the tear tear? And what is the gap between the tear and the tear? So here I find myself at a crossroads in my own creative and scholarly work. I'm putting the finishing touches on an 11-chapter book called Reading Architecture, an introduction to spatial literacy. And it's about a 300-page textbook, hardly illustrated, that I've been working on for 5 to 7 years. And I'm in between projects. So what's next? What's the next step? I'm looking at my interest in words and how I might take and develop this or project it into some kind of project. And one of them is this idea of homophones. So we can see the tear that tears. In this space could be a wall with ducts, some kind of ducts. Think of tear ducts. The ducts tear at the wall, and then the wall cries with water coming down into a channel. These are quick sketches for some ideas here. Box and boxing, which was really important to Le Corbusier. How do boxes box with each other? And if boxes can box with each other, what kind of a space do they make? Or is it possible that simply the patterns used to fold and make the box start to have an argument and proliferate and inveigle with each other to make new and different kinds of forms? Wind and wine, probably a little bit too motivated to be useful for my terminology. The gap isn't big enough here. But how does wind wind objects around itself? So looking at the idea of an architecture that captures the wind, obviously I've been inspired by some of the vernacular traditions here in the local wind towers. So wind and wind. Or tense. Tense, that's a funny one, right? You can be tense, or something can have a past tense. Language can have a past tense to it. How do we find architecture in that kind of tension? And I was looking at the Church of San Genevieve, which has these 3 nesting domes. It's a truly remarkable section. And thinking that's a pretty darn tense space. 3 intersecting domes, all having a kind of debate with each other of what their job is, and all of them trying to reach somehow to find the light that comes from one to the other. Another post-textbook possibility of mine is to revisit a series of already published essays and bring them together and fill in the gaps and create a collected works, except in this case mine would be collected words. And these are the collected words that would form the various chapters, potentially. Clinamen, grotesque, anamorphosis, skeuomorph, procrustus, and pellicular. And that's where the topic of the lecture enters. So clinamen is a term that comes down to us from Lucretius, and it has to do with the idea that atoms don't fall straight, that their weight produces an inherent swerve. So you can think of clinamen as the inherent life force of creative swerve that happens in architecture. It's not the straight line, it's the pressure that forces that line to swerve off of its path, a small deviation, but necessary. Grotesque, an article I've written years ago, looks at the Italian tradition of grotesque, a new art form based on Roman antiquities that has hybrid conditions of animal, mineral, and vegetable coming together to produce new spatial forms, new collisions, new objects. We can find that in the work of Mark Foster Gage, particularly his Helsinki Guggenheim competition, where they found all sorts of existing 3D models online and pushed them together to make this kind of monstrosity, this kit-bashed merging of animal claws and body parts and toys to make architecture that is his version of the grotesque. Skeuomorph, and this is a fun one, this has to do with atavisms, things in architecture that no longer function, but we still use them. Parts of our life that no longer function, but we still need them to look the way they do to help us negotiate between the past and the present. So in this case, what we have are these sandals that are made out of a complete piece of rubber to look as if they're woven together. But in fact, they're not woven. It's one single piece of material that's holding on to a vestige of how it once functioned. So think about when you take a picture, the click sound that it makes, that would be a skeuomorph. And once you start to look for them in architecture, you'll find that they exist in many places. Things as simple as having wood grain on plastic laminate to fake stitching on briefcases or shoes, and how that skeuomorph, in fact, acts as an ornament, that a detail that has become an ornament that's about to disappear. Procrustean, a bed in ancient Greece where you were tortured. If you were too tall, they would cut your arms and legs off. If you were too short, they would stretch you to fit. I think oftentimes architecture is a Procrustean box that we just shoehorn things into. Or anamorphosis, the use of perspective drawing techniques as a way to distort not just what's existing, but the designs that we're projecting into the future. How can we use drawing as a tool for bending and twisting space? And then pellicular. Stemming from the Latin pellis, meaning skin, pellicular has evolved to encompass such concepts as leather, parchment, hide, film, layer, membrane, plastic wrap, pellicula trasparente, scum, or a thin, partially reflected coating is on a beam splitter or pellicle mirror. It generated the English pellicule, a thin skin or film such as an organic membrane or liquid film, and the Italian pellicula, a plastic wrap good for cooking, conserving, and protecting. Exploring architectural enclosure as a pellicule contaminates foundational canons of classical purity with oblique metaphors concerning stains, pigments, scars, dressing, ornamentation, and cosmetics. So we can look at how the pellicular may be found in architecture through these various expressions. This is S-O-I-L. I don't know how to pronounce this firm's name. It could be soil if you put them together, or it could be so-ill. But it's S-O-I-L, and they shrink-wrapped the storefront for art and architecture as part of an installation. We have the UK Pavilion, which takes on the idea of pellicular as fur, that has these very long rods that have seeds at the very end of them, embedded in the very end of them, have a thick and blurry space that is not unlike a fox fur hat. Pellicular also meaning film, we can look in the most straightforward sense of projecting film images onto a facade. So here we have Krzysztof Wodicko's projection onto the AT&T building of 1984, where simply the projection of a hand onto the side of the building animates it as a kind of giant business suit, right? The gray anonymous suit of capitalism and business. So what I'm about to talk about, in fact, I gave at a symposium called Unmentionables, and this is the poster for that symposium that our interior architecture program put together last spring. And some of the talk is specifically tilted toward interior design and interior architecture. And because of the topic of it being unmentionable, it's supposed to be a little saucy. A literal interpretation of unmentionables as both underwear in its most transparent guise of lingerie and concepts in architecture of which we dare not speak. Pellicular zones are forms of enclosure that stretch and ply the boundaries of architecture through the thinnest of surfaces. In contradistinction to the concept of thick and inhabitable poche, which has enjoyed a recently revived currency, pellicular zones are hyper-thin spaces that even may be uninhabitable with the full extent of our bodies. So if we can't actually inhabit them physically, we can project ourselves into these spaces psychologically and imagine inhabiting them. Pellicular zones describe compressed atmospheres, condensation on surfaces, stretched and tensile wrappers, beguiling spatial conditions, the pellucid dissolution of architectural space and undergarments peeping out as an unspeakable act of ornament. What was Ludwig Mies van Dro's idea of skin and bones architecture? Was it steel and glass? And where did it come from? Writing in 1923 about a typical Eskimo house, he claimed, and I quote, Moss and sealskins have here become building materials. Walrus ribs form the roof structure. End quote. Consistent with his theory of baina nix, or almost nothing, Mies translated this observation into an architecture of hyper-thin enclosures, where the architecture almost disappears into a condition of pure transparency that glass skin provides. I will just repeat, he is proposing an architecture that comes from moss, right? Not just sealskin, but also moss. As far as the transparency and invisibility of pellicular zones goes, they may adhere abstractly to surfaces, as with Philip Johnson's claim of having, and I quote, very expensive wallpaper, in reference to the transparency and reflectivity of the surfaces of his glass house, where nature flattens onto the walls as abstract art. Scum, paint, dyes, and cosmetics construct pellicular zones, the thinnest and most pliable fusion of a material to the surface it covers. These peculiar pellicular zones envelop architecture in spaces of otherness and intimacy with a thinness that dematerializes architecture's status as an inhabitable solid. Just as lingerie is made to seduce, pellicular zones entrance, distract, and lead architecture astray from any strong distinction between inside and out. Next to the soap film left on skin after bathing, lingerie is just about the last apparel we wear before completely undressing. Generally transparent, lacy, and close-fitting, lingerie adheres to the skin as a filmy layer. Film and lingerie closely relate to each other as architectural states of dress and undress. Pellicular architecture concerns film, scum, paint, stains, cosmetics, and atmospheres as thin surfaces. Architecture's barest materials. Two recent essays about the architecture of Jacques Herzog and Pierre de Meuron tease out the significance of thin architectural membranes and surfaces that glimmer with seductive properties. Vittoria Di Palma and Geoffrey Kipnis each have theorized the thin, elusive, and seductive properties of Herzog and de Meuron's architecture, providing essential lessons for the construction of architecture, let's see if I can get this out, pellicularities. For De Palma, their work exhibits an ongoing preoccupation with the status of the architectural surface, while for Kipnis, it signals an urbane, cunning intelligence and intoxicating, almost erotic allure. In her essay, Blurs, Blots, and Clouds, Architecture and the Dissolution of the Surface, De Palma analyzes the Pfaffenholz Sports Center for the photographic chemical wash applied to the concrete cladding that gave rise to a modeled biomorphic pattern. I think there's a, what is it, here we go. So in here, through an acid wash, applying a photographically projected surface onto concrete, what we have is a slightly textured and three-dimensional surface. At the Eberswald Library, photographic images were etched onto the glass and concrete panels of the building's exterior in a repeating pattern. The firm collaborated with the photographer Thomas Ruff, who selected images from his private collection of magazines to curate the images screen printed on the library's exterior. As the architects state, the imprint of the entire facade unifies the surface. The differences between concrete and glass seem to be annulled. I would add, the difference between surface and ornament also disappears as the buildings become canvases for display of art. In The Cunning of Cosmetics, a personal reflection on the architecture of Herzog and de Meuron, Kipnis examines the signal box Am de Wolf, Switzerland, 1994, arguing that each copper band was painstakingly warped to engender a mesmerizing ephemeral gesture in light, shadow, and form over a large area of the skin. While the architects rationalized that the copper coiling acts as a Faraday cage to protect the electronic equipment inside from unexpected external effects, Kipnis claims that this argument is merely a smokescreen. The electric equipment in all facilities, such as switching stations, is adequately shielded from interference. Thus, the copper banding system does indeed technically produce Though the copper banding system actually does produce a Faraday cage, it's far from a functional necessity. Kipnis arrives at the conclusion that the signal box is entirely a matter of cosmetics, a hypnotic web of visual seductions that emanate entirely from the copper band system. A system, it should be said, that is in fact not the building's actual skin, which lies just beneath it. It only poses as the building's skin. At their Ricola production and storage building in Mulhouse, Brunstadt, France, the architects enclosed the short sides of the building with black concrete walls. Let's see if we can do this again. So we want to be looking right in there. They allowed water to shed from the roof down the sides into a deep bed of Alsatian gravel, forming a fine film of plant life so that a natural drawing ensues as the water drips down the wall. In other words, they choreographed the growth of ornamental surface scum. They also silkscreened translucent polycarbonate facade panels with a repetitive plant motif based on photographs by Karl Bloschfeld, allowing the interior to be compared to that of a curtain that creates a relationship to the site's trees and shrubs. Kipnis interprets this building as introducing a new coherence to architecture's conventional polarity between ornamentalism and minimalism. So it's pretty astonishing to see a firm that is so dedicated to immaculate modernist details to be scratching its surfaces with these ornamental patterns. It was a very radical thing to do when this building first came out. It's rather shocking. As he writes, when backlit, as seen in the interior during the day, the leaf pattern takes on an empty, numbing, camp fascination of a Warholian wallpaper, while on the exterior the images are rarely visible, emerging only fleetingly as hallucinations when hit at exactly the right angle by glancing light. For Kipnis, this slick, eye-catching device belies the range and depth of technique Herzog and de Meuron exercised in realizing the full cosmetic sophistication of the work. So Kipnis calls their work cosmetic. What precisely is cosmetic? What is cosmesis? And how might it tease out pellicular architectures? Vitruvius's architectural triad that a building should be solid, it should be useful, and it should be beautiful offers a useful entry point. This phrase is more commonly referred to as commodity, firmness, and delight. In De Re Edificatoria, Renaissance architect and theorist Leon Battista Alberti defined architectural beauty as consinitas, the harmonious and skillful arrangement of parts. The Latin terms Vitruvius used for his triad, however, are firmitas, utilitas, and venustas. He introduces the goddess Venus and her numerous pagan guises into architectural theory. The translation of venustas into delight is a kind of erasure of the presence of a certain kind of beauty that dwells within architecture. It's a more pagan beauty. As the Latin term for beauty, literally the salient qualities possessed by the goddess Venus, venustas clearly implied a visual quality in architecture that would arouse the emotion of love. Mario Perniola considers the plural implications of Venusian charm, with her name referring to venenum, which references venom or poison, as well as dye, tint, color, and by extension makeup, maquillage, cosmetic. Cosmetic derives from the Greek kosmetike, techne, meaning the technique of dress and ornament, and from cosmos, meaning cosmos, order, and ornament. As applied beauty relating to processes like dyeing, tinting, coloring, and applying makeup, cosmetics linger in the classical language of architecture with an understanding of beauty as only skin deep. It doesn't need to go any deeper. According to Mona Mahal and Osli Serbest, for the Greeks, cosmese meant the making visible of a surface and the creating of an appearance. For Gottfried Zemper, architecture can be related to decoration in referring to the universal idea of the Greek word cosmos, and its lexical meanings of ornament and world order. In 1856, Semper offered a lecture in Zurich titled On the Formal Lawfulness of Ornament and Its Meaning as an Artistic Symbol. On the lawfulness of ornament. He focused on the Greek word cosmos as both cosmos and cosmetic. According to Semper, Greek decoration implied the imposition of a natural order on the object that is adorned, a formal system by which art mirrors nature's cosmic laws. The relation of cosmese to cosmetics remains consistent with Greek temples, whose white marble surfaces were painted in vivid, bright colors. It also describes chryselephyntine statues, deriving, as I told you, I like to collect words, deriving from the Greek chrysos, meaning gold, and elephantinos, meaning ivory. These were gargantuan hollow bodies. The deities who inhabited the temples, these were gargantuan hollow bodies made of wood scaffolding to which would be attached various materials simulating a divinity dressed in full regalia. Thin pieces of ivory would be carved and painted to stand in for faces and skin. Sheets of gold leaf represented garments, armor, and hair. And glass or precious stones detailed elements such as eyes, jewelry, and weaponry. Semper traveled to Greece and Rome studying polychromy, seeking traces of paint at sites such as the Parthenon and Trajan's Column. But he also drew from Antoine Chrysostome Quatremère de Cancy's book, The Olympian Jupiter. Quatremère de Cancy numbered among the first scholars to argue for the use of polychromy in classical art and architecture, publishing colored illustrations such as what I'm showing you here, of the chryselephyntine statues of Zeus, Jupiter, at the sanctuary of Olympia, and Athena in the Parthenon, which Phidias constructed in gold and ivory. Quatremère de Cancy challenged the conventional reading of white marble as defining the quintessence of classical art and architecture, and by extension, Western cultural identity. In addition to arguing for the use of polychromy on statues and temples, he further disrupted idealized canons of classical purity when describing the incrustation of precious metals such as metals, enamels, and stones on architectural components such as stylobates, metopes, triglyphs, and ecroteria. He argued that a combination of paint, stucco, and wax was used on temples in order to cover material imperfections, to protect against weather and erosion, and to break the monotony of whiteness, or to provide some sort of trompe-l'oeil without trespassing into actual painting. As Quatremère de Cancy wrote, the use of marble by the ancients was so widespread that to leave it unadorned would have struck anyone who saw it as something rather cheap, especially in a temple. Colors were not merely used to make other materials look like marble, but to change the appearance of marble too. So you can see these traces in archaeological museums on the metopes and the triglyphs of marble that's been painted. But the thought of painting marble, just ponder it for a second, of taking gold gilt or taking red paint and covering this perfect white veined marble with paint. It's anathema to how we think about the use of materials, and yet at the same time, to have dressed a temple in any other way would have made it seem naked. At least this is the argument that we have Quatremère putting forward. Semper picked up the debate, arguing that the first temples were stage platforms for communal rituals, scaffolds upon which were attached decorative flowers, festoons, sacrificial animals, implements, and shields. Eventually, these elements became permanent colorful ornaments such as fillets, egg and dart motifs, arabesques, rosettes, meanders, and labyrinths. This form of cosmesis allowed Semper to approach architecture as structural makeup. Given the potential for architectural form to be undermined by its own decorative program, it's little surprise that Adolf Loos would struggle with ornamentation in his landmark essay, Ornament and Crime of 1908. In a piece of writing that left the indelible impression on architects that ornament is a crime, Loos counters, that ornament is a crime, Loos counters this principle when acknowledging that the urge to ornament one's face and everything within one's reach is the origin of fine art. So there's a lot of ambivalence in Loos. Modern man shouldn't ornament, but yet ornament is the origin of art. So there's a lot of kind of contradictions and oscillations that go on in this essay. Loos's objection to ornament resided in understanding that the ornament produced at his time bore no relation to contemporary culture around him, that it was something that was an add-on or an extra. It didn't relate. As Loos assessed bodily ornament, the modern man who tattoos himself is either a criminal or a degenerate. And yet, Loos described the origins of architecture as pellicular, writing, "In the beginning we sought to clad ourselves. We sought to cover ourselves. Originally consisting of animal furs or textiles, this covering is the earliest architectural feature." He expressed this sentiment most clearly in the bedroom he designed for his wife Lena, featuring a pale blue wall-to-wall carpet covered with an Angora rabbit fur rug that curls up to the base of the bed. It scarcely needs to be said, then, that for Loos, ornament is an unmentionable part of architecture, meaning that a building should not make mention of it. Despite Loos's protest to the otherwise, built into architecture's most essential function as the sine qua non of the Vitruvian triad is the beauty of applied ornamentation that elevates mute buildings into expressive architecture. More importantly, by virtue of the concept that building is utilitarian and architecture requires an aesthetic supplement, architecture is inhabitable ornament. Nonetheless, due to Loos's prohibitions, the application of pure and unadulterated ornamentation to buildings offers the pleasure of transgressing architecture's proper boundaries. So thanks to Loos, who he may be read or misread as putting a taboo on ornament, he's created an architectural taboo for us to now transform, transcend, subvert, or engage. Collaborating with artists as do Herzog and de Meuron in the design of architecture places designers in the position of giving up agency over their product while introducing ornamental excess into the picture. When Daniel Buren applied translucent colored film to Frank Gehry's Fondation Louis Vuitton in Paris, he temporarily stained this architecture's material clarity with pink, green, yellow, blue, and orange filters. He also produced an interior zone of pellicular space constructed upon the simple transformation of light streaming through colored film. We also can see this kind of a transformation in MVRDV's Glass Farm. This was built in the Dutch town of Schindel to replace a destroyed structure that had inhabited a space between the church and the town hall. This is Winnie Moss's hometown. When I first saw this project, I thought, oh, they just recreated the building that was there. But no, that's not what happened. They really didn't have records of the existing building. So they went around to farmhouses in the area, and they took photographs of vernacular architecture, and then they recombined them to make up the barn that wasn't there, thatched roof and all. And then they projected it onto glass walls through the use of fritting. So you can see a building that it's a paradigm example of pellicular in that it's filmic, it's projective, it's thin, it's highly spatial. You can almost inhabit or feel yourself inhabiting the space between the glass and the brick. And it's even furry if you look at the thatching on the roof, which you can start to see through. So it produces a kind of textured, thick zone. We might imagine Loos turning over in his grave at the prospect of Rem Koolhaas and OMA's haunted house, an exhibition space at Fondazione Prada's offices and permanent galleries located in a renovated gin distillery in Milan, Italy, that is covered in 24-karat gold leaf. As one of 7 existing buildings on the site, the firm devised a compositional strategy for this older structure to stand out among the others by cladding it in gold leaf that dematerializes form into pure shimmer, and which, according to Koolhaas, was more affordable than traditional cladding such as marble or paint. Koolhaas, however, was not entirely innovative in suggesting the use of this material and an iconoclastic approach to covering a building. It should be remembered that Frank Lloyd Wright recommended gold leaf to cover the concrete exterior of falling water. And his renderings showed the Guggenheim Museum in New York as painted pink. Apropos of 1960s spatial thinking, in the architecture of the well-tempered environment, Rayner Banham diagrammed the difference between campfires and tents when advocating for an environmentally responsive architecture unrestrained by the weight of massive and immobile walls. Campfires radiate heat and light to produce a warm glow that brings people together, in contrast to the tent's membrane, which deflects wind and excludes rain, but also segregates people. Due to its ability to produce space through gradient heat patterns, instead of parietal walls, pellicular zones privilege the campfire as a preferred direction for architecture to follow. The campfire describes an architecture produced by environmental rather than structural systems, offering a model for experimental enclosures that rely on radiation and air movement. From 1963 to 65, Hans Haacke experimented with interior space by sweating a clear acrylic plexiglass box in a work, a sculpture titled Condensation Cube. And just a little bit after Haacke's work, turning art into a terrarium, experiments in Art and Technology's Pepsi Pavilion for Expo 70 in Osaka, Japan, launched this research into architecture by collaborating with the artist Fujiko Nakaya for the design of the film of fog engulfing the pavilion. These two projects offer important precedents for approaching Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro's Blur building in Switzerland for the Swiss Expo of 2002. Permeable, wet, and even mobile, the cloud that the building produces comes from an integral spray system of siphoning water from Lake Neuchatel, providing pellicular zones as an evanescent cloud. The building did not contain a conventional architectural envelope separating the inside from the outside, but relied on a moist and ephemeral vapor to give it form. The zeitgeist of the 1960s research into natural models for the dissolution of interior and exterior barriers finds Fry Otto experimenting with soap bubbles, the ultimate filmic material. The continuous surface of these liquid tensile structures seamlessly slips from inside to out. While Otto's tensile enclosures offer a model for eroded distinctions between interior and exterior surfaces as total environments, his bubbles, like Klein bottles, haunt architecture with the promise of minimal surfaces built of soap film. They also explore the utopia of anti-gravitational structureless transparent worlds that float among society with prophylactic disdain for physical contact with others. And I've got a signal to give here, and let's see if this works. This is so funny. We're doing a little experiment here. You guys have to, yeah. Yeah, there you go. Where'd you go? No, you have to blow them up in the air. Yeah, we need, I didn't know where to get a bubble machine, but I think you get the idea. In 1972, House Rooker installed Oasis Number 7 at Documenta 5, where the building seems to be exhaling a spherical bubble of interior space from its facade into a transparent room for lounging in a tropical environment. In 2007, Kengo Kuma designed the floating tea house for the World Tea Festival in Shizuoka, Japan. Writing about this project, Kuma states, "It seems that a tea house is, after all, a kind of device of virtual reality." He produced a floating body made of a large balloon filled with helium gas, and then enclosed the space with an exceptionally light cloth called super organza. And in 2013, Neri Oxman produced a pavilion based on an enclosure constructed in real time and space by silkworms. So you can see the little worms. This is draped over a substructure underneath that allows the worms to do their work. For the Venice Biennale of 2008, Philippe Rahm explored architecture as meteorological space in digestive Gulf Stream, arguing that architecture's role is to create temperatures and atmospheres instead of spaces. Rahm suspended two metal planes at different heights in order to produce the division of space as thermal flow. He heated the lower plane to 28 degrees centigrade and cooled the upper one to 12 degrees, constructing, as if with bricks and mortar, the phenomenon of convection, in which rising hot air cools on contact with the upper cool sheet and falling, is then reheated on contact with the hot sheet, thus creating constant thermal flow akin to an invisible landscape. While the deterritorialized zone of film and convection, as Otto's bubble research suggests, may seem to be utopian in terms of future, yet to be materialized envelopes, these pellicular spaces are much closer to reality than one may think. Annie Chu and I analyzed the space of entrancement, the entrance is entrancing, in the theater district on Broadway Avenue in Los Angeles, exploring the way in which interior spaces are colonizing cities. What we discovered is that pellicular zones abound, but because they are generally unseen, we tend not to notice the pliable boundaries in which they operate. So I collaborated with a colleague of mine, Annie Chu, and this research was published in the Los Angeles Forum for Architecture and Urbanism's newsletter in a special issue called Interior Urbanism. So the idea is to see the relations between interior design and urban design. Outdoor heaters, smoking clusters, misters, thermal thresholds, air curtains, glowing lights from inside and out, even condensation on windows, constituted a pellicular zone already in place. They're everywhere. We just don't see them as architectural moments. But in fact, they are probably some of our most important architectural moments, perhaps even in living here where we have such radical temperature differentials, to see these gaps and these thresholds and these misters and these sealers as a way of creating space that we have now intentionally claimed instead of given up to the tenant to sort of apply at will or willy-nilly. So Annie and I, what we did was we mapped, I'm sorry, this is not really showing that well, but we mapped the various thresholds between the street on Broadway and the various theaters. So this is a part of Los Angeles that was a theater district. Now the theaters are all gone. The area is going through gentrification. And so these stores are they're like Gap or Forever 21 or much more high-end fashion outlets. But the zones in between, particularly in the eatery areas, from the street all the way through these vestibules, become these zones of ambivalence, where you can have the merging of the inside and the outside, a much more fluid and dynamic kind of space. People who are on their laptops at a coffee shop working outside, but the information that they're gathering, the connection they're getting to the grid is coming from the inside. Smoke that drifts in, cold air that drifts out, all of these different slippages between inside and outside. And they're also ephemeral. So, at a club at nighttime, you'll have a cluster of people making a big smoking pack. But then by 3 o'clock in the morning, that's where somebody comes and sleeps for the rest of the night. He'll be up and gone by 8 o'clock in the morning because that's when the people are coming back to buy their coffee to go to work. So you have this constant movement through cities of shifting interior and exterior spaces that are not as stable as architects might like to think they are. Right? That whole edge, that whole zone of the city becomes an exteriorized interior to a certain extent. So that's what this study was all about. As Nakaya's work at the Pepsi Pavilion started, she continued this with an installation at Philip Johnson's Glass House in 2014. As this project indicates, the design of apparatuses that prolong or embed interior spaces into themselves or to the exterior realm offers emerging sites for architectural research that blurs interior and exterior boundaries. They also serve as spatial ornaments, augmenting the environment with often superficial or extraneous devices to create spaces of pleasure that provide added comfort to our epidermis, to the pellicular zone of our own bodies. If pellicular ultimately refers to skin, then any embellishment that engages this zone may be both visible and invisible, but it's always ornamental and applied. Thank you.